Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you are. Thank you for tuning in. This is episode 6 of Asian Highway, Storytellers in Action. Welcome to AH1, coming to you from Little Tokyo. We are in the beginning of spring, so we have a lot to talk about as the new season dawns upon us. Today specifically, we're going to be introducing to you our storyteller from, she's with the New York Times, but she's calling us from Beijing. Her name is Amy Qin. She's going to talk to us about Overlooked, which is a great project through the New York Times to recognize some of the most legendary women who have lived throughout time, but were, as the title says, overlooked in the New York Times obituaries. So we're kind of getting in a time machine here and going back and reliving or kind of revisiting some of the great accomplishments of many women who have done so much for us in the world.
Is there a DeLorean involved or no?
It would be nice if there were DeLorean involved, but maybe there is. We'll see. But so we're going to talk to Amy about some of the stuff she's done through Overlooked and with the New York Times. But before we get to her, I want to talk first about this big news that's coming out involving Facebook.
What kind of news, Barimo? I'm curious to know.
This is not DeLorean news. This is current news, right?
Okay.
What kind of information is being shared about this incident?
Well, what isn't being shared? That's what I want to know.
I see what you did.
Yeah, what isn't being shared, right? So, we have this firm who's apparently been, I guess we should say, harvesting our information and sharing it to influence elections and what have you.
I hear they went to Cambridge.
That's a little bit of a pun there. But yeah, so I don't know what you guys think about this. Are you going to stop using Facebook now? Stop using Twitter? What do you guys feel about what's going on?
So here's my take on this, right? Having sort of followed this story, there have been so many leaks, even outside of Facebook, where we've had banks and things that had accounts of people through different kinds of retail and stuff like that lost or lost security, and that information was given up. And last time I checked, there's still people that shop at those places that go through that same bank. I remember with Target, that was a huge thing, but as far as I know, people still shop at Target. I mean, I think more people shop at Target now than they did back then.
I still go there.
Right. I mean, I do too. I'm guilty as charged. I may not use their card as much, but hey, Target is Target. But with Facebook, this is a huge thing. This is obviously going to hurt their bottom line, which it currently is with investors and things right now, as the story's going. I don't think this is going to change the way people approach Facebook, because Facebook is such a thing where people get their validation, the likes, the replies, the responses, all those things really feed into the validation center, so to speak, in people. And so even though this whole thing happened, this whole ordeal is taking place right now and all these things are coming out, you'll have a certain subset of people that say, you know what, I'm done with Facebook, I'm deleting this immediately. But those are people that were probably not fully invested in the platform to begin with, and they could have gone either way. There's going to be some people that say, oh, this is a real big shame, but you know what, I kind of like seeing, the 30 likes that I get on these posts.
Well, I hope people will like us on Facebook.
Yes, you can definitely find us on Facebook, and please do check out our page.
Right. Remember you were saying?
I was about to ask both of you what you thought, how this compared to like the Equifax breach or any other, you were talking about hacks of various sorts that have happened. Identity theft versus identity theft. I mean, there are two different types of identity theft, right?
Right. And I don't know where I stand yet on this, because to me, this is such a fresh item, at least in the context of us talking about this today. I'm not even sure what the impact is if this is going to be it. I mean, I could tell you my vote in the 2016 election was not influenced. I knew what I was going to do with or without Facebook. So at least from that perspective, I don't even know I don't know what the fallout is in terms of where am I a victim? I don't know yet.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, the people that might have been catered to, are they going to say, oh, but wait, I was turned into a schmuck and now I'm going to stop using Facebook? Right. I don't necessarily know that the story's going to go down that way, Right.
Well, we could have a whole episode on this, but today we're here to talk about this great New York Times endeavor, which Amy is a big part of. So going to bring on Amy Qin now. Like I said, she's calling us from Beijing. She's working on this great project called Overlooked. And so, Amy, first of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about Overlooked. Why don't you, I guess I'll set up the meta. She's going to kind of throw the first question here, and we could talk about how this whole project evolved.
Yeah, I mean, this Overlooked project has been amazing, especially for all of us women. Can you share why Overlooked happened, and why did it happen now? Why did it take so long? And was there sort of a moment, a ta-da moment, where the New York Times decided this is the way to go, or the group of you, all your colleagues decide to do it?
Mm-hmm. I didn't take credit for this project at all. I mean, the credit should go to our digital obits editor, Amy Qin, who wrote an essay on the New York Times website about how last year when she came into the job, she started receiving a bunch of reader mail from people asking why doesn't the New York Times do more obituaries on women and on people of color. And I think as a person of color herself and as a woman, that really resonated with her. And so she started sort of looking into it, and it was kind of in the back of her mind. And I think she says that one day she was researching something about tennis, and she came across this tidbit about a woman, Mary Outerbridge, who was credited with having introduced tennis to America. And she looked into the archives, and she saw that there was nothing about her in the New York Times as far as an obituary goes. And I think she was pretty shocked to see that. And that's sort of, I think, how that project was sort of born. And since then, it's really evolved, and she joined forces with our new gender editor, Jessica Bennett, and they solicited suggestions and ideas from a bunch of the reporters, including myself. I first heard about the project in January at a big meeting that we have in Hong Kong, and I was really excited about it. I had written a few obituaries before, mostly for men, one for a woman, and I really enjoyed it, and I thought that it was such a good idea. And I was talking to one of the editors about it, and I was like, oh, well, who should I do? And she was like, honestly, I can guarantee that pretty much anyone that you think of, we probably haven't done an obituary for her.
Nice. Yeah.
Especially because, I was looking at women from China, and so that was an entire added layer that made it more, I think, difficult. So, yeah, that's sort of how the project was born.
With this whole excitement of doing Overlook, this idea sort of coming together, and you and your colleagues saying, okay, we have this great opportunity here. When it really came down to you deciding, okay, who am I going to pick for my obituary in Overlooked, how did you go through that process to pick who you picked?
That's a good question. When you speak about recent Chinese history, there are a few names that sort of come up all the time. You think of Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. She actually does have an obituary with the New York Times. And then you think of people like the Song sisters, Song Meiling, Sun Qingwei, and they also have obituaries. I was happy to discover. But after those names, pretty much it was, a blank canvas. And so when I was looking at the list of potential names that I wanted to do, Cho Jin, who I ended up writing about, really jumped out at me because she was so forward-thinking for her time. I mean, this woman was born in 1875, and she had her feet bound and was expected to be a lady in the home and not to have a job or anything. And she really struggled against that. And I think like some of the other women that we ended up profiling, like Ida B. Wells, she really sort of struggled against the confines of the society and just broke out and started dressing like a man. She advocated for the overthrow of the Qing Empire. She advocated for women's rights, and in a way that nowadays maybe doesn't seem so, revolutionary, but at the time it was so unheard of. So I just thought that, this is an ongoing project. We'll be doing obits probably, throughout the year and maybe after that as well. And so I thought it would be good to start with her.
Great. And I just want to give a reminder that the New York Times has been publishing obituaries since 1851, and it's been heavily male dominated. So this project is really great in terms of it's really catching up with all that's happened in the past 150 years, 160 years, and even beyond that. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah.
We're kind of playing catch up. So
yeah. So then, as a follow up with Cho Jin, and by the way, I read your obituary, which was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
You know, you had some concept of who she was prior to writing it, and then in your time researching, going into it, deep diving, what did you come out of it in terms of things that you picked up that you may not have known prior to going into her story?
Oh, there was so much. I mean, I only knew about her very vaguely, but the one sentence biography of her is really something. You know, this woman unbound her feet, dressed like a man, advocated for overthrow, sold her jewelry, sailed to Japan, left her family, and then was beheaded by imperial forces for conspiring to overthrow the government. And then when I started digging into it, I kind of bumped up against what is often the challenge, I think, in China, reporting on sort of these old historical facts, which is that here there hasn't really been a fairly objective sort of history making, in part because the party in power currently, the Chinese Communist Party, has been in power for 50 years. And so we haven't really seen a very critical history. And so it was difficult she's been sort of elevated into this martyr of the revolution. And so it's really difficult to separate facts from fiction. But I try to nod at that in the piece. But I spoke with scholars about it. You know, they don't even know what year exactly she was born in. It could have been 1875 or 1877. Wow. They're not sure where exactly, maybe Xiamen, but maybe somewhere else in eastern China. So I was sort of surprised to see how fuzzy the facts were about her life. And also, I guess the one thing that I was sort of surprised about is that she's really held up as a feminist hero. But someone commented, you know, she was also really violent too. And I don't think that obituaries are just about people who have necessarily, you know, done great things in their life.
And I want to share a line that's from her obit. At the very beginning, it says, "With her passion for wine, swords, and bomb making." That's how this starts.
That sounds like a good time,
right? But so I want to kind of bring this back to the larger project here with Overlooked. There are plenty of women featured here beyond who you wrote about. We have the author of Jane Eyre, and we have the woman who helped build the Brooklyn Bridge. What did you learn from the other obituaries that were told in terms of how they influenced your reestablish a certain viewpoint of the world to you? Just what did you learn from the other stories you read?
We only came out with the initial rollout with 15 obituaries, and that by no means, makes up for all the people that were missing. And I think that obviously the New York Times is very committed to continuing this project. So the 15 aren't sort of
sure.
It's not a comment on these are the 15 most important women. It's almost a little bit arbitrary. Like I said, this woman just came to mind. But I learned that there were some very remarkable women all around the world whose achievements, for whatever reason, were overlooked. In part, it was because society overlooked their achievements, and so it never really came to the attention of editors. And in some cases, it was because of the editors themselves, for whatever reason. Tended to be focused on white men. The statistic that 1 in 5 obituaries, only 1 in 5 were about women, is really stunning to me. And
that is stunning.
So I enjoyed really all of them. I think people, New Yorkers and Americans, were really surprised that some of these very famous names like Sylvia Plath and Charlotte Bronte and Diane Arbus never received obits. That's pretty amazing because they did become quite recognized in their lifetimes. But I was really shocked to see some of the other names as well. I mean, Ida B. Wells, for example, we wrote about her wedding, I think, but we didn't write about her death. So,
oh wow.
Yeah, I hope
Wow, that's intense.
There will be more people that come out.
Oh, definitely hope so. And thank you so much for definitely bringing as much as to our attention. I know Devish has a great follow-up to this.
Yeah, Amy, one thing in reading the obituary, again, I thought it was very well written by you. I'm kind of a big history buff. I'm sort of a history nerd. And some of my friends know that about me. Reading the story that you presented for Cho-Jin, it sounded remarkably similar. And she lived in the 19th century. There was another revolutionary that lived in the 20th century that was born in a certain place, then left to fight the establishment, kind of picked up things, picked up revolutionary friends, and then went back to his place of birth to sort of take on the establishment. And it's crazy how similar and how many parallels there are between Cho-Jin's story and Fidel Castro's story. The only difference being that Fidel Castro obviously waited out the establishment and was able to take over the government and move forward, whereas obviously we know with Cho-Jin, she kind of met her fate when she returned to her homeland. And I thought it was really cool to have those parallels. Like, one took place in China in the 19th century, and then you had a very similar story taking place in North America in the 20th century. Having said that, is there a possibility, especially in the current climate that we're living in throughout the world and not just, say, in the United States, that, in the 21st century, can there be a similar such movement or occurrence that can happen?
Ooh. I mean, I don't want to make predictions. I'm really not in the business of making predictions. But I think that, what you point out is really true, that these themes sort of tend to repeat themselves. And I think that's why obituaries are so fascinating, because they draw out the lives of people who live in particular contexts. But really, these themes of revolution and standing up for ideas, these are themes that tend to repeat themselves throughout history. So I think if we take history as a, indication, then maybe we'll see this again. But I would hesitate to predict anything.
So wait, let me put a little spin on this then. So instead of making a prediction, I guess what can we learn from her life to kind of what's our takeaway from her specifically? Like, are there lessons to be learned? Takeaways that make us better?
I think that the lesson to be learned from Cho-Jin is, at least in the context of China, I mean, we're seeing a big feminist movement in China as well. And I think that it's easy to, especially here where things change so quickly, to take a really short view of how movements happen. But I think the stories like Cho-Jin really remind us that there were people a long time ago who have been advocating for similar ideas. And this is what we're seeing now with the Me Too movement happening in countries all around the world. It's really built on efforts that were started long before we were born. And I think that a lot of feminists in China, they are focused on these short-term goals, but this is a good reminder that there are women, there's solidarity. There's women who were fighting for these same ideas a long time ago.
Right.
So sharing these stories, it's been quite an endeavor, but how has it so far enhanced your life, both as a journalist and from the point of view of a personal storyteller?
I really love doing obituaries. There's a really great documentary. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's called Obit. It's about the New York Times Obit desk. It sort of goes into why obituaries are almost the ultimate form of storytelling in a way, because you're really just going into someone's life and talking about their accomplishments. Right. And that's been so fun for me, because it's really inspirational. I mean, you're really delving into history and thinking about people's lives and the decisions that they made and going to, and so that's been sort of very uplifting for me personally. And I think living in China, there's so much going on here, and every day there's a lot of very depressing things going on. There's also some uplifting things, but I think that going back in history has actually really helped me change my view on the country, which makes me see it more as a sort of continuation of a long tradition of people who are working to make this world a better place, it's really easy to become very short-sighted with the 24-hour news cycle and what's going on here. So that's why I really enjoy doing these kinds of stories, and I hope to be doing more in the future.
Yeah, and these obits are kind of coming from all over the world, China and here in the U.S. What's the common thread that you seem to see across all of this? And also, is there a common thread for each of the women in terms of how it relates to everyday America?
It's a good question. Well, I think the common thread is definitely that, I read some crazy statistic about how many people pass away every day, and the New York Times can only choose, a handful of those people to write obituaries about. So I think that the criteria generally is that this person must have accomplished something pretty significant in their life. And for women, I think that the New York Times it's a very global paper. We have correspondents in countries all around the world. But I think that it's a newspaper born in the United States. And so the readership is very American-centric in a way. And as a result, speaking for myself, I'm always looking for ways to speak to the audience back home, whether it's my own family or friends or whoever who maybe don't know that much about China. And so as a result, I try to look for stories that resonate with things that people are familiar with back home.
Got it.
Yeah. That's just why, one big criticism, I think, of the Times, at least with this obituary that I wrote about Chojin, is that the tagline was, she was China's Joan of Arc, which people were like, can't she just be Chojin, like China's Chojin? Why does she have to be compared to this Western figure? And I think that's a really valid criticism, but also it's taking into account the audience. People don't know anything about China sometimes, or maybe they only know very little, and so it kind of gives them something easy to grab onto, using something that they're familiar with. And so I think about it a lot, and I don't want to say she's, China's Joan of Arc either, but in terms of helping the audience understand.
Yeah.
Well, maybe Joan of Arc was, the European Chojin. Right?
Maybe.
Exactly. I think we need to go back and issue a correction.
Right.
Edit.
We have something to work with there.
So, Amy, I want to make sure that we don't overlook your story.
Right?
No pun intended. So, obviously we were talking a little bit before we got on here about, how you lived in the U.S. and the United Kingdom, and then you went back to China. So obviously there's a journey there that took place. First of all, tell us about that journey and how that journey helped you evolve, not just professionally, but also on a personal level.
Well, my journey, I don't know, it's something that's so interesting. When I report in China, people really think that they never want to talk about their stories because they think it's so not interesting, even though they lived through crazy times like the Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward, because they're like, everyone else went through this. I tend to think that the same thing about my story. It's a pretty typical story of an ABC, American-born Chinese. I grew up in California. I was born in Wisconsin, but grew up in California in the Bay Area in a town called Pleasanton. And then
Pleasanton.
I know Pleasanton.
Yeah. Do you? End of a part line.
I hope you're not a San Francisco Giants fan, but if you are, that's okay.
No, I'm an A's fan. Bay.
Okay, that's okay.
You're cool. You're cool. Respect.
I did have a fantasy league one year. That was the height of my baseball.
Oh, nice.
Nice. But I was a Warriors fan before the Warriors.
Before the Warriors were this good.
Fair enough.
Good, yeah.
Right.
And then I went to Berkeley, and I think that what was sort of most formative for me was in high school in Pleasanton. I did this competition civics program where I really got into the U.S. Constitution. And then when I got to undergrad, I took a few courses in Chinese politics. I think that's when a lot of people start realizing, so many ABCs are forced to go to Saturday school and learn Chinese, and they don't actually learn anything, but their parents are forcing them to do it. And then you get to college, and then you're like, oh, I want to find out more about my roots, my heritage. And so you see, you definitely saw at Berkeley a huge amount of people who were suddenly interested in learning Chinese, and I was definitely one of them. But the interest in the Constitution sort of led me to the interest in Chinese politics, because I was so fascinated by how, in the way that we take the Constitution in America so seriously, in China, it plays a completely different role. It's a little bit more politicized. And so I was interested in learning more about how that system worked, and that just led me down this rabbit hole that I'm still in today about authoritarian governments. And I continued to research that while I was doing my master's at Oxford in the UK. And then I just came out to Beijing after that, and it was a really natural transition, and it's been really fascinating to see what's been going on here. I mean, just earlier this week, China approved an amendment to its constitution to basically end term limits, which is open the way for the president to stay on for life if he wants to, which is a really big break with recent tradition. So
that is a Chinese import that we don't need.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And by the way, just a quick seg here. Debesh and I had a little bit of a chuckle because when you said ABC, us Indians have ABCD, American-born confused. It's American-born confused Desi.
And Desi is what Indians refer to themselves.
Really?
Yeah.
So we're ABCD.
So we're right there with you, sister.
Yeah. We're right with
you. Would you say ABI ever? No.
No, ABCD.
Because we Indians, we call ourselves Desis in our language, so we are American-born confused Desis.
I'll take it one step further. So I'm from a region of India called Gujarat, and so we are ABCDEFG.
I've heard that.
American-born confused Desi, emigrated from Gujarat.
From Gujarat.
Yes.
Housed in Jersey.
Housed in Jersey, yes.
I just went to India.
But that's going to take up the whole time.
I just went to India for the first time.
How was that?
It was a complete opposite to China, and perfect in that way. It was really fascinating.
So, elaborate. What was different?
In
what was different about
here, everything is so planned and sort of Soviet in the sense that the color palette is shades of gray, including the sky. India is, to be cliche, but it's so colorful, and there's so many things going on, and people, I know it's not, it's almost like people are sort of forced to tolerate all the differences. Here, everyone's kind of shoved into the same, mold, but I felt like in India, you just couldn't do that because there's so many different religions, languages, cultures.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting.
Sure.
Yeah, you seem to have traveled across Asia to a lot of different countries, and you're from America, you've lived in the UK, you've now lived in China. There's a big debate about the terminologies of expat versus immigrant. What would you consider yourself, or if not, would you create a new terminology to describe your experience so far?
Well, I don't think I'm an immigrant because I don't have plans to stay here for a while, for, the rest of my life. But I have sort of been looking into this because there is this differentiation between, for example, expats or domestic workers, which we see with a lot of the helpers that come out of, they call them helpers. They're really domestic workers or maids that come out of often countries like Philippines or Indonesia to countries like Hong Kong or the Singapore. And I find the distinction a little bit, it's a little disturbing for sure. And I have always sort of identified myself as an expat, but I think if I were to be living in one of those places, like in Singapore, it basically, the label kind of entitles you to different kinds of, entitles or limits you to different sort of things. So, for example, a lot of the domestic workers in Singapore only get one day off a week. They have a curfew. They go home once every 2 years. You have to have an employer and live with your employer. So I don't know. It's really disturbing to me. I think that it kind of, there needs to be a rethinking of that.
We're going to shift gears slightly so it's pretty much the last question. We'll end it here. and to set the context of this question, our season theme for this first season of our podcast is music. So I know you've covered stories all over the place, all over the world. But there's two stories that I read recently from you that stood out. One was on hip hop in China, and there was another one on the North Korean orchestra performing it in the South. And so I kind of want to harp on those in terms of, would you seek both these stories as telling a story of basically a fish out of water, a new element coming into another country, and how basically the music is a way to transcend storytelling, or basically to connect human beings. So like you said, you have hip hop in China, or the North Koreans in the South performing an orchestral piece. How is music basically used, in your view, as a great way to connect people and really tell a story of humanity more than our differences? Even though there are differences, how do we connect through music?
I really love the power of music. I mean, like most good ABCs, I grew up playing piano and clarinet and various other instruments. And I found that here in Asia, it's so easy to politicize words that music is one of those things that you just can't, it's not easy to politicize, because it evokes a very visceral reaction that is beyond just what are you saying, And of course, it can be political, and there are many instances in which music has been politicized. But I think that overall, it sort of speaks to another level in terms of the human mind, and that it does create a kind of sense of community. And you saw that with the North Korean orchestra performing in South Korea right before the Olympics this year, which was really historic. And then with the hip hop scene in Chengdu, it's really fascinating. I mean, it's really happening all across China, but you're seeing these young Chinese people who love hip hop and kind of are making it their own. And there's a lot of talk, of course, about cultural appropriation and whether or not, are they giving credit for the originators of hip hop. But at the end of the day, I think you can't argue with the idea that it's so amazing to see this genre that really was born in the U.S. really take hold in China. And I think that's really, really powerful. So there's a lot going on here in terms of the music scene. It's really exciting.
Well, I think a trip for us to visit China would be in order, just to explore.
It's definitely on the Asian highway.
Yes.
So.
And we'll if Amy, if you're still there when we visit, we'll have to visit you.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yes.
So, Amy, real quick, can you share with us now where people could find out more about Overlooked? What site do they visit? Is there a way to track it on Facebook and Twitter? Where are the places people could find out more about Overlooked?
Definitely. I think, first of all, go check out the obituaries that we have up there at nytimes.com/overlooked. And I would urge everyone to go, and if you have any names that you think of that we should be doing obituaries about, there is a form for that on the website that you can submit a name and a reason for why you think this person deserves an obit. And I already have a list of 20 people going.
Wow.
And yeah, it'll be an ongoing series. So just look out for it.
Very cool.
Excellent. And how can people find you or get in touch with you? Is there Twitter or an email they could reach out to you?
Yes, yeah, definitely. I'm on Twitter. My handle is Amy with an extra Y at the end for my middle name and QIN. And then I also have a website which has a form where you can fill out and get in touch with me too. So that's the easiest way.
Okay. And what's the website?
AmyQin.com.
What's the address for that? Got it. Okay. Excellent. You could also find us. You can find us on Facebook, Asian Highway 1, and despite this Cambridge story, we encourage you to visit us there.
Yes. Asian Highway 1 Live.
And, Asian Highway 1 Live. Got me stumbling there for a minute, sorry. You can also find us on Twitter and on Instagram. Both handles are the same. It's AH1 Live. You can also find us on email, asian.highway.live@gmail.com.
And to hear this story and others, you can definitely check us out on iTunes, on Spotify, Google Play Music, and YouTube.
And Amy, we really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. It's been a great story. We've learned so much.
谢谢.
Yeah, there we go.
Thank you very much, Amy.
Okay, Amy, we'll talk to you soon, hopefully, and Yeah, and yeah,
Come out to Beijing.
we will.
We will. I want to meet your dog.
I guess.
And the cat.
And the cat. There we go. Thank you so much.
Thank you.